Muted.
And you're unmuted.
Yeah, such a pleasure. I'm happy we get to do this, even though it's from afar, but I can still feel your energy. So happy to be with everyone, especially as we have the time to dive into one of the most intriguing and fascinating stories, which is the adventure of Israeli politics. Now, just like Justin said, I'd love to hear from you and answer anything that you're interested to touch upon. But maybe to begin with, I'd love to, share a few pointers about where we've been, where we are, and maybe a little bit about where we are going. So, Israel is a startup nation. And as a startup nation, we make a lot of interesting and ingenious things. One of the most fiendish of those items would be the Israeli political system. It's a quagmire of unbelievable proportions. There is a reason why you had the process of the Mishnah and the Talmud, because it all culminates in what happens within the Knesset, supposedly 120 members of Knesset, but the chaos is a world and a half. So maybe to touch upon this, I'd like to start by saying that this preceded the existence, the reemergence on world stage of the State of Israel. Because the Jewish coalition as such did not begin when Israel was reimagined and reestablished. It actually started already when Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress, and with the idea that 2 Jews, 3 synagogues, 3 Israeli politicians, 10 synagogues, you wanted to bring together different representatives of schools of thought, factions, ideas, visions, as many as you could possibly bring together to create a critical mass of action. And his direction of bringing as many together as possible and creating groups that partnered together to move forward moved not only through the Zionist Congress, but even during the existence of the Yishuv. The Yishuv was the description of the Jewish settlements within the mandatory Palestine territory under the British rule, in which the British allowed the Jewish community to manage its own affairs, and that was done using 2 institutions. One, it was an elected assembly. The elected assembly brought together various factions of different directions and different ideas and vision within the Zionist settlement and Zionist leadership. And from within that elected assembly, we moved to the creation of a national committee. The national committee is what was at the time the government. So we have a history with creating these coalitions. Now, what happens in the course of time is that in order for a prime minister, for an elected leader, to be able to rule and get into office, he has to create a coalition. The electoral system in Israel is not such, aside from a small period of time, that you're able to elect directly the leader, the executive, the president, the prime minister, but rather voting for a party, and the leader of the party that's able to bring together as many other parties as possible is the one that's going to be the prime minister. Now, it takes time. Creating a coalition, I assure you, any prime minister you ask will tell you that they would love to skip that. In between the elections and the actual assembly of the government, when you have to negotiate and trade, and it's an unbelievable trade. The time that it could take ranges anywhere between 20 days, when it was easier and the structure was simpler, to 100 days at the beginning of the state, to around 80 days in the recent elections. Now, as we grew, as the State of Israel progressed, as the State of Israel was able to take in more olim, more new immigrants, it became more and more diversified. And that diversification manifests itself in the Israeli political map. So what are we looking at? We're looking at a gradual process in which I can share with you as a trivia piece that the only prime minister who was able almost to reach the magical number of 61, the majority within 120, was Golda Meir 2 years after the Six-Day War. It was in 1969 that she came close to achieving this number, the unattainable number at any point before or after. But what we've seen in the culmination of this process, of this equilibrium, is the grand 80s. And what am I referencing? I'm referencing the National Unity Government. At the time, during the 80s, the 2 main blocks, the right and the left, Labor, as it was represented, and Likud had around 40 members of Knesset each, whereas the other factions, the other parties, had to play around with the 40 that you had. So in between this block of around 80 members of Knesset between two parties, you were able to create a somewhat stable government and electoral system. So in 1984, a national unity government comes into place, in which there is a distribution of power between the labor leader, Shimon Peres, and the Likud leader, Yitzhak Shamir, both of whom each gets 2 years in office as prime minister. That is the perfect equilibrium. This was a rather successful government, or considered to be a successful government for Israel, one that was able to drive Israel out of inflation, one that was able to be done to a degree with the first Lebanon war. There were other incidents in the course of that. Maybe I'll refer to it when we have the Q&A, because like Justin said, I can dive into hours and hours of this. But then we're moving in the direction of 1988. And in 1988, something changes, because the power dynamics, which is what I want you to pay attention to, is changing as we move along, and it's going to change rapidly in the following decade. Why? Because in 1987, the first Intifada erupts with terrible terrorist attacks, as it was then, even though by the standards of today, God forbids, even terror evolves in such a horrendous manner. But at the time, several terrorist attacks are taking place. The Israeli public is unhappy with the direction that it's taking. And even though the same principle as today applied at the time, the world was pushing Israel to withdraw and to give, the Israeli public retaliates. And how do they retaliate? The 1988 elections see a strengthening of the bloc. And when I said the bloc, I think today more people understand what that is. It's the joint right-wing and religious parties. And the bloc has a majority. The bloc is actually able to establish a government, coalition government on its own. It does not need the left, and it does not need the Labour Party. So in 1988, 1 year after the beginning of the first Intifada, we have a situation where the right wing and the religious parties have 65 members of Knesset. And even though that's the case, the desire, especially after the success of the 84 government, the desire is to create a national unity government again, even though this time, because there is no real need for labor as such, Shimon Peres is not given the position of alternative premier or subsequent premier in a distribution of 2 years and 2 years, but rather Yitzhak Shamir assumes leadership as prime minister, whereas the minister of finance will be Shimon Peres, and Minister of Defense at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, of blessed memory, who would later on become Israel's prime minister in 1992. So in 1988, we have another national unity government, only this time it doesn't last. Because after 2 years, something happens within the Israeli Knesset. For the first time ever, by the way, up to then and since then, it was in 1990, I believe around the month of March, where an Israeli government was toppled through a vote of no confidence in the Knesset. It was toppled because, if you remember at the time, the pressure mounted on Israel to start in the direction of a peace process with the Palestinians. Peace process that would entail sitting with the PLO and negotiating for the first time with the Palestinians 3 years after the beginning of the first Intifada. And then what happens? Shimon Peres and the left start fidgeting, and they feel uncomfortable in a government led by Yitzhak Shamir, because they know that Yitzhak Shamir was a very strong in his position of never negotiating with the PLO. And they wanted out. And the idea, what they chose to do, was very interesting politically. They decided to subvert the government from within, join hands with the ultra-Orthodox in order to topple the government. And indeed, through that partnership with the ultra-Orthodox, I can tell you that the members of Shas, the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox party, missed the vote of no confidence in the government, and therefore the government could not rely on their vote to sustain itself, and the government fell. Yitzhak Shamir became a transitional government in preparation of a new government that's going to be established, and at that point, Shimon Peres had the promise from the ultra-Orthodox, who promised him that they would go along with him and create a government that for the first time would be made of the left-wing Labour Party and the ultra-Orthodox. Think about that for a minute in today's terms. Would that even be possible for the left to partner with the ultra-Orthodox? And indeed, Shimon Peres is sure that he has 62 members of Knesset. Later on, Yitzhak Rabin called the entire episode the dirty drill, because what happens on the day of the vote, when the new government was supposed to be sworn in, and Shimon Peres is ready, and I believe it was one of the only times that his late wife Sonia came with him to the Knesset in honor of him establishing the new government. And they're about to take a vote, but they look to the left and they look to the right, and they notice that two ultra-Orthodox Knesset members are missing. And these were two Knesset members, Mizrahi and Verdiger, who chose not to come after pressure from New York, from the Lubavitcher rabbi, who called them and said that because this is a government that's going to give in territory, you cannot vote it in. That brought about a resounding failure, and one of Shimon Peres, the late Shimon Peres's great disappointments, because 3 months after the government was toppled, a new government was established, and that was the second Shamir government with the bloc of the right wing and the ultra-Orthodox. In 1992, roughly about 2 years after that, you have another set of elections. And at the time, Israel is rife with demonstrations, with civilian unrest. There is outcry as a result of terror. How many of you remember the name Helena Rapp? Think about that for a minute. Helena Rapp. Helena Rapp was a 17-year-old girl, if I'm not mistaken, walking down the street on her way to school at 7 a.m. in the city of Bat Yam. A Palestinian terrorist runs in her direction. It was around Purim. He stabs her fatally and kills her. Riots erupt all over Israel as a result of a sense of insecurity by Israelis. Think about that for a minute. Israelis felt insecure as a result of this attack. It's a fact that I remember it, as many Israelis do. And that civilian unrest, those demonstrations against the government, along with a sense of corruption overall, after the dirty drill by Peres and other political shenanigans around those years, have resulted in a revolution. In 1992, when the next election takes place, the Labour Party wins. It wins a number of 44 members of Knesset, where the late Yitzhak Rabin receives the power by the president to negotiate a coalition. And together with Meretz, the left-wing party Meretz, just think about this, Labor and Meretz, left-wing, together in the elections of 1992, have 56 members of Knesset. 56 members of Knesset. I mean, in the last elections of this March, Labor and Meretz together had around 5, 6 if I really push it. 5 members of Knesset, 56 in 1992. The Rabin government comes into place, and joining hands with Shas, with the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox, and the Oslo Accords take place. And as Matty Friedman writes in his op-ed of a few months ago, something changes in the mindset of the Israeli electorate, because the Oslo years have created such a trauma as a result of all that transpired in the course of that tumultuous time, where you see a gradual process in which the left wing continuously shrunk. If you look into the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, and then the second Intifada, and again, the Israeli public sees the lynching in Ramallah and does not have hope that the Palestinians can ever be reasoned with. And as a result, they've grown accustomed to taking a more conservative, status quo aspiring path in which no risk can be taken in light of the lessons that had been learned. And as a result, you see a process in which the right wing is strengthened and the Israeli center. There is a bigger chunk within the Israeli population that makes its decision on the day of, if not a minute before the ballot is cast. No more commitments. So you see the rising of central parties in Israel, whether it's the Third Way in the mid-90s or others, Kadima, when that broke away from Likud by Ariel Sharon, Olmert, Tzipi Livni. You see a different entity now, an entity that represents the middle section of Israeli politics, the wobbly middle section, the one that will look to the right and left and make its pick a minute before they have to cast a ballot. Now, Netanyahu establishes his second government after 1996 to 99. His second government is established in 2009, and ever since he's been in power, which brings us to where we are today. Because in many ways, those points of friction within Israeli society that always manifested itself in the political map of Israel, whether it's secular versus religious, political right versus political left, whether economic right and economic left, social rights and social security. All of this became hazed to a degree and hidden by the big debate of the last 3 rounds of election. And that is Benjamin Netanyahu. Are you in favor of Benjamin Netanyahu or are you against Benjamin Netanyahu? Up to a point that if you look into the 3 rounds of elections, think about the blue and white party. The blue and white wasn't a party, it was a coalition of 3 different entities, one led by former Chief of Staff Bogi Ya'alon, one led by Yesh Atid's Yair Lapid, who's been in power for a while and has a political machinery of sorts in the past few years, and the other one led by Benny Gantz, the blue and white faction, the party of resilience, Israel's resilience. And the 3 of them created blue and white. And in the course of that time, if you look into their positions on economy, on the Palestinians and others, there isn't that much of a difference between them and the mainstream of Likud, not even between them and really the actual positions of Benjamin Netanyahu. Yet the only difference revolved around, are you in favor of Bibi staying in power or are you against it? Which brought us through a first round of elections, and then a second round of elections. And then after the third round of elections, during the coronavirus, and in a period where fourth election would be too much of a threat for Israel, drove blue and white to its end, in which Benny Gantz parted ways with Bogi Ya'alon and Yair Lapid, and joined the 5th Netanyahu government. The 5th Netanyahu government is one of the largest governments Israel ever had. And when I say large, I mean the number of ministers and deputy ministers. You're talking about around, I believe, 34 ministers in that government. And the number of parties that compose this government is also incredible, because you're talking about an overall of 8 parties. 8 parties that compose a government that's rather fragile. The right-wing bloc that has Benjamin Netanyahu, the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox party of Shas, the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox, and Orly Levy, one member of Knesset who was a party. She ran, by the way, along with Labor and the left-wing Meretz. And on the other hand, you had the blue and white bloc in the government that includes Benny Gantz's blue and white, that includes the Labor Party, by the way, 2 members of Knesset. The 3rd member of Knesset of Labor Party decided to stay out, and another 2 member of Knesset party that parted ways with Bogi Ya'alon, and that I'm talking about Yoaz Hendel and Tzvika Hauser. So all in all, the blue and white bloc has around 19 members of Knesset. The right-wing Likud plus religious bloc has 54 seats in the Knesset, and the number of ministers is supposed to be the same. It's not. Benny Gantz allowed Bibi some more wiggle room there, but it's supposed to be an equally mandated government that has the same number of ministers and that talks about that kind of division of power. Now, we can dive into some of the stories behind that, but I want to end my quick note by saying this. On Sunday, for the first time, an Israeli incumbent prime minister faced the district court in Jerusalem to answer accusations and indictments on bribery and breach of trust. It's never happened before. And Prime Minister Netanyahu ran on that docket. The Israeli electorate knew very well what the question was, whether a prime minister should be allowed to govern under these conditions. And the Israeli electorate answered by supporting Netanyahu's position, not only directly by supporting Likud itself, but also supporting other satellite parties that declared that this is their position. But naturally speaking, that was not the position of Blue and White. Blue and White ran on fighting corruption. They ran on standing by the Israeli legal system. And the more we progress in the direction of, let's say, the progression of the court case against Netanyahu, the continuous assault by members of the Netanyahu faction on the police and the attorney general and the courts, the more difficult it's going to be for Blue and White and Benny Gantz to remain together with Benjamin Netanyahu in the same government. So it's a very fragile coalition, and these days are the very first days in which it's coming to some sort of a test. So that's, in short, a quick story about where we're going and what we've been through. And I hope that you were all able to actually sustain at least part of that.
Thank you so much, Shahar. That was certainly insightful for me. I hope it was for everyone else. While we give everyone the opportunity to ask questions through the Q&A function, that's where we'll be fielding questions throughout the evening. I'd like to start off for you. Given the fact that Israel's structure of government was very much founded upon, removing, certain elements of the British mandatory system, and then replacing them with sort of what I would call like superficial, like sort of Jewish characteristics. Like rather than, singing God Save the Queen, we sing Hatikva. Rather than the Union Jack being up, we have a Magen David. How much do you think that current system, which we've had for 70 plus years, which certainly when we implemented at the time, Israel was at war, it was a new country, it was a young country, it was not strong, and certainly with a dominant Labor Mapai party and a very Ashkenazi socialist demographic, Ben Gurion was allowed to rule in this way for so long. Given the fact of how Israel's demographics have changed and how its political and sort of societal nature has become much more diverse, much more Middle Eastern, much more pluralistic, what would you attribute to our problems today from that original choice 70 plus years ago? And what do you think we can do to change it in order to make it more representative of who we actually are and where we're going?
Well, there is an inner contradiction there, Justin, because think about this. Is it not representative of who we are, in the sense that you give a vote to almost each and every possible faction on the Israeli political map, and even that changed, because if you look into the history of who's able to enter the Knesset, the threshold percent used to be lower. It used to be around 1.5 to 2% of the what we call the legitimate, the kosher votes that was able to make it into the Knesset, and today it's way above 4 in an initiative to try and stabilize the system. But it didn't really, did it? It didn't stabilize the system. And what it did do, though, thanks to Lieberman, and I do specifically mention this because he was a proponent of that move, was take the Arab parties and galvanize them to a point where from 4 members of Knesset, which they had 5 in 1992, they have around 15 today. So they were able to come together and really establish a significant faction within the Knesset. Otherwise, it was done with some of the smaller parties, but it did not really contribute to a stable coalition, as you can see today. Even now, it took 76 days for this new coalition to come together. So is it representative? Is it too representative? Maybe it's time, somebody asked, hey, look at this government. There is a corona crisis. There is an economic issue in Israel. How could it be that you have so many different ministries in which you had to dissect each and every ministry into different portfolios and to be able to give enough people enough dockets? Mm-hmm. And the truth has to be said quite frankly. When you have such a system in which you are allowing that kind of freedom for people to vote, politicians have ego. They want to have an influence. They want to have a role. If you want to have less ministers, then make sure to concentrate your vote in one direction, which is, by the way, what Benjamin Netanyahu has always been trying to do in his election strategy through and through, which is to strengthen the Likud. In its worst, he brought down the Likud to 12 members of Knesset. Now think about this. A decade later, he is the prime minister under indictments, which the Israeli public is fully aware of after November 2019, when the Attorney General actually shared, it was leaked, to the media outlets the 57-page indictment in harsh detail, and I don't recommend you guys read it. And even though this was in front of the Israeli public, the prime minister is still able to bring 36 seats to the Knesset plus one of Orly Levy. So there is a big dilemma there. And when you think about that dilemma, we think about the threshold to enter the Knesset, and we think about the direct election, Justin. If you remember the 1996, when it was, you had the rule to directly elect the prime minister, when we tried a new system, and then in 1999, and it didn't work. The fact that the prime minister was elected, it brought about a different situation. Yes, I could vote for Bibi as prime minister, and that's great. But immediately thereafter, the Israeli electorate felt, then I will vote for Shmegegi party. And Shmegegi party, I'm sure, will help the prime minister. But that was not the case, because the prime minister suddenly stood at the helm of a shrunken party, and he had to have those Shmegegi parties. So the whole barter of coalition got only worse, which led to again changing the system in 2003. I think that changing the system in Israel would be somewhat equivalent to us having a constitution. Either it's going to take time until it happens, or the Supreme Court will have to constructively create one for us. Otherwise, we are stuck with our fragmentation, which forces us to be apart and then forces us to come together.
So based on what you're saying, is it fair to say that, and I know this may sound harsh, have we reached a point of systemic failure, that the system in place can no longer provide what it's designed to do?
Failure is a harsh word, because when you look at Israel, you can see that Israel has not been a failed state. The government has been able to produce, the economy worked properly, mostly. Even the recent coronavirus crisis was, up to now, knock wood, khamsa, was okay when it comes to how it's being handled, very harshly. I can tell you stories about friends of mine who just traveled from New York to Israel and have to stay in quarantine for 14 days. And that is no laughing stock quarantine. That is the kind of quarantine we have Israeli police knocking on your door 2 to 3 times a day, asking for your ID. Can you show it to the drone outside your window so that we make sure you're home, kind of quarantine. So, but it's definitely reached a point where something is going to give. And what do I mean? I mean that at some point when nature takes its course and Benjamin Netanyahu will no longer be the prime minister or in Israeli politics, whichever way it's going to be in 5, 10, 100, 1,000 years, at that point, the Israeli political system will have to come together and reassemble itself in thinking, okay, so now that we no longer have pro-Bibi and anti-Bibi, what are we all about? And who are we? And what should we focus on? And maybe that in of itself will propel a process where a new system of governance will be created, either top-bottom in the sense of the system itself, or bottom-up, when the Israeli electorate will come and say, okay, we understood the fragmentation of the system doesn't work, enough with the smaller parties, this is how we're going to go.
I agree. That's definitely a long overdue conversation in Israeli society and politics. Now that we have some questions, I'd like to introduce some of these, and you and I can field these together and kind of see where this takes us this evening. So we have a question from Rachel that says, I'd like to understand more about your opinion on the viability of a one-state solution, acknowledging that this is a common or popular position on the quote-unquote right in Israel, but does it have a lot of support? What would need to happen before we could achieve this?
Well, I have to say that this is what I want you to get in the mindset of Israelis when it comes to one state, 2 state, 5 state, 6 state. Oslo has seared a true bloody memory in our hearts. You know, I remember it myself, along with many Israelis who came together and for the first time watched the news and saw the American president, along with the Israeli premier and Palestinian leaders standing together and hoping that, you know, our kids are not going to have to go to the army. And then the whole thing explodes in our faces. When buses after restaurants, after shopping malls explode in the heart of Israel. We lived in a reality where every week you'd lose dozens of people. Can you imagine? Every week buses explode. And the Israeli media, not that I'm hailing Israeli media in general, but at the time it didn't even know how to handle this. And what do I mean? I mean that there was no censorship. So on the cover page of Yediot Achronot, the leading paper in Israel, you would see the actual visual of the bus post-explosion, no blur, no nothing. And that was on the cover of the paper, actually feeding that terror in your mouth in case you missed the endless TV filming from the site itself. So that experience was seared in our hearts with blood. And as we moved forward and went through the traumatic incident of the assassination of the late Prime Minister Rabin, can you imagine the waves, the hatred, the animosity, the emotion within Israeli society? The entire place was as bubbly as lava, if not much more. And you move from there in the direction of, we're not sure where we're going to go. It's 1999. The Oslo Accords were signed for 5 years. It's about to expire. And boom, it's Prime Minister Barak trying to go to Camp David and push a settlement onto the Palestinians. Clearly, Yasser Arafat wasn't ready. And when I say Yasser Arafat, what's again seared into our minds is his speech in 1994 in the mosque in Johannesburg, in which an off-the-record talk on a Friday afternoon, he was asked about the peace agreement with the Jews, with the Israelis, and he said this is like the Hudaybiyah contract. It's like the contract signed by Prophet Muhammad and the Jews, which means to say it's only temporary, and as soon as we're able to breach it, we will, because that's our intention. And that suspicion grew in the hearts of Israelis. And then you come into the second intifada, as if the mid-90s of the Oslo Accords is not enough. You have the second intifada, and boom, again, series of explosions, horrible terrorist attacks that led, if you remember, from the defensive shield operation in the West Bank to toppling the Palestinian Authority. So we have a history. And from that point on, Olmert made his attempts with Condoleezza Rice and Mahmoud Abbas, but there is a great wound within the Israeli public as to the actual willingness of Palestinians to acknowledge the Jewish Israeli existence in the region. And that is a very significant point on which a majority of the Israeli public is united. And the majority of the Israeli public, in spite of the fringe right and the fringe left, would very much like to go in the direction of some sort of a settlement with the Palestinians, be that as it may, whichever one that we creatively can come up with. But as far as the feasibility of that happening, which leads you to the idea of a one-state. What is a one-state solution? The notion of a one-state solution, as difficult as that may be, is the idea that we're going to move forward regardless of what they do. We have to somehow figure it out. We cannot continue just waiting for them to do what they want to do. We have to move in the direction that's good for us, even if that means that we are going to control and annex the territory, and they'll have a certain status until they're able to change that status, or whatever we have to figure out, which takes me back to 1987. Because in 1987, on this game of Jeopardy, 1987, the negotiations between then Israel's foreign minister in the National Unity Government, when you had Shimon Peres in London, negotiating with King Hussein of Jordan. And in the course of those negotiations, King Hussein agreed to take possession of the West Bank and share the control of the holy places in the same way it's being done now with the state of Israel, in the sense that some people say Jordan is the Palestinian state. So there you go. Jordan will own the West Bank and will rule the Palestinians. And Shimon Peres was very excited. By the way, the secret to reaching that agreement was doing the dishes. When both of them, Shimon Peres and King Hussein, were negotiating in the home of Lord Mishkon of the Jewish community leadership in London, and nobody was in the house aside from Lady Mishkon, who was doing the dishes every time for the few days they were there to negotiate. And at some point, there was a stalemate. And King Hussein looks at Shimon Peres and says, "My dear friend, it seems unfair that the lady has to do the dishes all the time. How about if we give her a hand in the kitchen?" And Shimon Peres, who loved doing the dishes, goes along with King Hussein. And as they spend an hour in the kitchen over dirty plates and mugs, they reach that agreement. And they were very proud of that agreement. And Shimon Peres was eager to come back to Israel and approve it in the government. And as soon as Yitzhak Shamir heard about that possibility, he immediately derailed it. In a classic Shamir style, when Peres told him about this, he stayed mute and said nothing. And right after that, leaked the contents to the papers, at which point King Hussein was very upset and the whole thing was toppled. So one-state solution, two-state solution, three-state solution, maybe that's going to be the case. Maybe you're going to have a Hamas state and a Palestinian Authority state, because goodness knows, as much as we're having difficulties negotiating amongst ourselves, can you imagine what's happening with the negotiations between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority after the 2007 throw them off from the rooftops while they're tied and blindfolded, the PLO officials? So it's very tough to say. And I think that at this point in time, we're not even at the process of thinking about engaging with the Palestinians in any kind of dialogue. So it's tough to talk about a one-state solution, definitely not in terms of the BDSers.
You know, it's funny, as far as you mentioning that story with Shimon Peres and King Hussein, you know, only a year later in 1988, you know, the Hashemite Kingdom gave away their right, their claim to the West Bank. You know,
as a result.
Right, based on the concern of, well, we already have, you know, 50+% of our population is Palestinian or identifies as Palestinian. What's to stop everyone from saying this is a Palestinian state? Let this just be Palestine. But, you know, to kind of get back into the question, you know, for all of us who are on this call who are familiar with Feel for Truth, who've gone through our boot camp programming, you know, one of the things we very much emphasize is that you need to negotiate your terminology before your ideology, meaning words matter. You know, we are and we are not walking encyclopedias. We are in the sense that words mean something to us and we understand what those meanings are, but also those are not universal meanings. They mean different things to different people. So one-state solution to you may mean one-state solution to somebody else. Two-state solution to you may mean two-state solution to somebody else as well. So in order to understand what that really means, in fact, is it viable, is it not viable? It depends what's in the details. You know, I could watch a movie that has a particular title, but if nothing in the film actually meets the description of the title, what did I just watch or what am I dealing with here? So when it comes to the political instrument that we want to use to settle our conflict, our grievances, and obviously our aspirations with the Palestinians, them and both us, in my opinion, anything that we put forward needs to accomplish effectively three things. One, needs to be sufficient for Israeli security or sense of security. Second factor needs to deal with Jewish redemption. We did not wait 2,000 years to come home just to have a slice of Tel Aviv and Haifa. That's not what Zionism was all about. It was a return to Zion, which obviously refers to Jerusalem and the surrounding area, the cradle of Jewish civilization in particular. But also, Palestinians have real grievances. They've gotten screwed royally over the past century, not exclusively by Israel, a lot from the British, a lot from Arab countries, but they need to feel whole as well. Their grievances need to be met. We need to create a structure that both of us can feel like winners in the same outcome. Otherwise, no matter what we put forth, one state, two state, five states will not work.
I want to mention something. You were talking about terminology, so I just want to share a story just so that you understand how sensitive that is. In the agreements, when we negotiated the Oslo Accords, I remember the discussions within the negotiating teams, the I's and P's as we call them, the Israelis and the Palestinians. And one of the questions that came up was, how do you address Yasser Arafat? Remember, we're talking about the mid-90s. Do you call him president or do you call him chairperson? Because he was the chairperson of the Palestine Liberation Movement. And in Arabic, the word is Ra'is. Ra'is in Arabic means both president and chairperson, but the agreements were written in English. So what do you write in English? Which word do you use? The Israelis at the time, by the way, we insisted on it can't be a president because there isn't a state. So you're president of what? There is no president here. We wanted chairperson Arafat. And that's how we stated also in all of the English statements, but they didn't agree. So what was the compromise? What was the word chosen within the Oslo Accords? And it won't surprise you to hear that the word chosen in English was Ra'is, R-A-A-I-S, Ra'is Arafat, so that everybody was happy and we all knew what we were saying. So when media outlets that were more liberal came to interview the Israeli negotiators and said, President Arafat, we used to always respond, Chairman Arafat. And there is great importance to the kind of words we use and also great importance to explain that the way you use that term by the individual it has its own meaning. When Yasser talks about a one-state solution, we know what they mean. And rather than the end game of coming together in what Muammar Gaddafi once said, Israelstein, this is more about the obliteration of the Jewish state. So that also has to be made clear in your interactions with others, because it's not a neutral term. None of this is a neutral term.
100%. I want to get to our next question here from Jeffrey. Elephant in the room. Will Bibi annex the Jordan Valley before U.S. elections? And I think let's add to that, will he annex the major settlement blocks in the areas that he's talked about annexing before?
So there are two levels here. I want to go back to what you said, Justin. Let's think about for a minute, what does annexing mean? Like, what exactly is the territory that Israel is going to annex? Is Israel just going to take, let's say, the settlements, what is under Israeli control, the Jewish settlements in the West Bank, the blocks? Let's say it's all of the settlements, or maybe it's only the blocks of settlements that are, the larger blocks that are always going to be there, that even the Palestinians in the exchange of letters and the negotiations understood that it's not going to go anywhere. Or is it going to be the Jordan Valley, which is absolutely essential for Israeli security? Or maybe it's going to be all of the above. So the big question is, what is exactly the Israeli government going to do? And here is the bigger question in my eyes. I know everybody's talking about the elephant in the room, but I want to talk about Godzilla in the room. And let me ask you this. How come nobody is trying to take this and ask, hey, you know what? What I heard from Trump and from Netanyahu, that if come and negotiate. Jared Kushner said as much. Come and negotiate to the Palestinians. Come, sit at the table. Tell us what you're willing to do. Let us know your position. How can we work together? And nobody seems to be asking, where are you of the Palestinians? It's always an automatic that we have to stick by the Palestinians. We always have to represent them because they don't represent themselves. Think about the major failure here, because in the entire course of the Obama administration years, where you had an administration that was very much willing to push forward a resolution between Israel and the Palestinians, that demanded Israel to free settlements, that exerted immense pressure on the Israeli government and on Benjamin Netanyahu, but you weren't able to get anywhere, right? Because in many ways, you're more Catholic than the Pope. Nobody, while the Palestinians were sitting on the fence and seeing everybody else fight for them, nobody told them, hey, come into the ring. Do something on your behalf. Now, and again, I'm not getting into American politics, but the change of attitude with this administration has been, okay, you don't want to negotiate, you despise us, you despise Israel, great. We're just going to move forward. And suddenly Jerusalem happens, and the embassies move, and things happen on the ground that change Palestinian condition to the worse. So in a way, it was a message. For the first time, the Palestinians received a message that even if they stay on the sidelines, things are going to happen. So they had better pick themselves up and do something, or otherwise they're going to miss the train. I am not entirely convinced that this is a bad message. And I'm not entirely convinced that the right response to this would be, hey, before something happens, guys, sit at the negotiating table. You have a chance to change this. You want something else? Show us what you want. They are yet to show us any of that. I want to add to that the internal political discussion. Benjamin Netanyahu supposedly wants to move forward with annexation. He has always been very good at making declarations when it comes to right-wing policies. Yes. But if you look into actual execution of right-wing policies, I am not entirely sure you will find his fan base with the Israeli ultra-right that will say that Netanyahu has been promoting ultra-right-wing policies when it comes to building in the settlements, when it comes to evicting Khan al-Ahmar. There is a list of topics on that issue. And here you have Benjamin Netanyahu, who is in the coalition, and you have Benny Gantz. And Benny Gantz mentioned and repeatedly said that they will not allow for our peace agreement with Jordan to be toppled. They will work in tandem, hand in hand with the Americans, to a degree with sensible Europeans, in order to do everything that we need to do the proper way. So here is a direct result of this coalition government that's been created. none of them can take a step without the agreement of the other. So Netanyahu can't go at it on his own as if it's a right-wing ultra-Orthodox party, a government, because he has to have Benny Gantz's blessing. So whatever it is that Benny Gantz committed vis-a-vis the Israeli electorate can actually take place now, because if Netanyahu chooses to go in a direction that's not palatable to Benny Gantz and blue and white, he will not have a coalition. And not only will he not have a coalition, he's probably going to be ousted from the Knesset altogether as a result of a combination of his indictments and the fact that he's not the prime minister. We can touch on the legal issue later. So it's a very complicated issue, and like anything complicated and very complex within Israeli politics and the policies when it comes to Israel, it'll probably be decided about 2 minutes before deadline.
Speaking of the palatable nature or lack thereof of Benny Gantz's sensibilities, our next question is actually directly asking, what are the differences between Gantz and effectively his party, or blue and white, whether it's blue and white or resilience? You can answer that the way you'd like. And Bibi's party and the Likud in terms of security. How different are they really?
To be honest, just between us in this room, I don't really see any significant difference between the mainstream Likud positions and those held by blue and white. Again, we are in a reality composed by the pro-Bibi, anti-Bibi. But when you look into Benny Gantz, who was Bibi Netanyahu's chief of staff, when you look into Gabi Ashkenazi, who worked hand in hand with Netanyahu in various positions, you don't see even Yair Lapid, by the way, the head of the opposition. Now think about the opposition. It's like Dante's hell. The opposition that's created in Israel now is Yair Lapid of Yesh Atid, Bogi Ya'alon, former chief of staff, Yamina with Naftali Bennett and Smotrich, who are, these guys are more to the right, more to the right, and the Arab Party, together with Lieberman. It's a coalition of none. Because when Netanyahu looks at them, he sees partners that can never play ball together. So that, for him, is the realization of a dream, really best case scenario when it comes into the kind of politics he can lead. So I don't think there is much of a difference. I think there is a lot of less politicking and more responsibility politics on the side of blue and white. They're fresher, they're younger, they're eager to prove themselves, they want to do things right. Netanyahu has been part of the political scene for many years. He knows almost every trick in the book. So the fact that you have Benny Gantz and his party in the coalition means that on the one hand, they'll be able to hold him off on executing some of the more dirty tricks in the book. But at the same time, Israeli politics has a lot of regulations and mini regulations, and you really need to be conversant with the material in order to know where it's going to come at you, from which committee of the Knesset a resolution may come that will subvert you. Usually it's done at night when people are sleeping. So literally, by the way, when you talk about the regulation of the book in the Knesset, you know who is the best MK who knows this book by heart? And members of Knesset actually go to him and ask for his counsel? Ahmad Tibi of the Joint... The doctor, the gynecologist, Ahmad Tibi, and former Arafat advisor. He knows the Knesset's procedures in and out. And I don't know if you notice, it's always the small moments in Israeli politics, but Netanyahu partnered with the Joint Arab List right before the Knesset was dispersed for the first time, before the September elections. And he reached agreement with them to go to elections. He knows, they know how to work together behind the camera. Make no mistake. And even at the moment of comic relief, as they were swearing in the Corona government, and I think it was during the speech of Benny Gantz, and Benny was heckled by Yair Lapid's faction and Bogi Ya'alon as a traitor. How dare you go with Bibi? And he was answering them. There was a bit of a back and forth there, and the camera caught Benjamin Netanyahu turning backwards and looking at the person sitting behind him and exchanging hearty laughter, and that was Ahmad Tibi. So these guys...
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, based on what we've seen over the past 3 election cycles, sometimes the only adult in the room on occasion looks like Ayman Odeh, and obviously by extension with joint list, Ahmed Tibi. And it's not like I feel good or bad about saying that.
Right.
That's
Just
an
a
objective
reality.
observation. Yeah.
Right. Don't take Israeli politics too serious. Just
No,
serious enough.
Let's try to get through 2 more questions before we have to wrap things up.
No!
Yeah, sadly. Obviously, as we talked about, we could do this forever, and there will be a future time for this, fortunately for us and for everyone who's still here. Question from my friend Shani. Are you at all concerned about the impact unilateral annexation might have on security coordination with the PA security force or the stability of the West Bank and, by extension, perhaps Jordan?
Yes, I think many people are. Many people are. And when you talk about the decision of annexation, yes or no, the main qualifier would be the ability to execute anything in coordination with Jordan and with the Palestinian Authority. This is a very fragile situation that we have there, especially with the threats coming from Iraq, continuous Iranian attempts to subvert, and of course, talk about the West Bank and Hamas's pressure to incite another round of intifada. Nobody wants to play into their hands. Having said that, the Palestinian Authority is heavily dependent on the IDF. Many of the operations conducted by the IDF in the dark of night to apprehend Hamas activists help the Palestinian Authority. Some of these operations are a direct result of that security coordination. That security coordination was put to a halt by the Palestinian Authority a few days ago in sending a clear message to the Israeli government that annexation is unacceptable. Having said that, at the very same time, the Palestinians sent other messages to Israel saying, listen, we're making our declarations, but we're not interested in violence, so we have to navigate, because they also have to make their position clear vis-a-vis their own public. That's why I keep on saying that the only solution to this discussion, and if it's done wisely, will be by calling for re-engaging in negotiations between the parties, while making sure that the Palestinians take the cue and understand that the only way to move forward would be for them to jump off the fence and join us on the field and actually try to score a goal for them, because they've been suffering and losing in the past couple of years in a very tangible way. So if they want to continue on this losing streak, they can feel free to, moan and complain. But if they're interested in changing course, then we need to see some seriousness on their end. Mm-hmm. And in saying all of that, we haven't said a word about a security threat that is Hamas, that's still holding the corpses of IDF soldiers, plus some Israelis hostage to their wills, that still threatens Israel with rocket launchers every day. So even if you do reach some sort of a settlement or even an interim agreement going back to Oslo with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, what's happening in Gaza?
No, very true. I mean, I certainly think one thing that can alleviate that tension or that prospect of destabilizing the West Bank, or further inflaming sort of the passions, the prejudices, and the grievances that are currently being exhibited. One thing that I think would go a long way is that if Israel showed how serious it was about making steps toward a real lasting solution that really meets Palestinian grievances, Palestinian desires, and obviously not the expense of Israeli ones. So right now, the PA, receiving its taxpayer, receiving all this funding either from Israel, certainly from European governments, through NGOs, members of the PA security force are paid Palestinian Authority public servant salaries, which are meager by certainly Israeli standards and along with European standards. Having Israel actually cover the bill and showing that we are actually, we're not trying to take over for you. We are not trying to kick you out of your job. We're not trying to remove you from your homes, but to show that they're actually serious in being a partner and being a permanent member of this land, of this country, of this region, really actually taking steps to show that it's serious about taking that responsibility and taking real, tangible, concrete steps in doing so, whether that includes paying salaries of PA public servants, whether it is about permanently alleviating or relieving Palestinian ability for freedom of movement. There are a number of different things you can do to show that this is not a ploy, from the Palestinian perspective, to just take more of Palestine, to take more of our land. These people are actually serious about being a part of the future with us.
I want to take you, if I were the Israeli foreign minister today, and if my deadline or supposed deadline for annexation is discussion in July, then I would call now and every day as of now until June 30th and say, Palestinian, negotiate, negotiate, negotiate. Now, once you do that, and there is a sincere attempt on your end to negotiate, and the Palestinians refuse to negotiate, and it's visible, to everyone in Israel, by the way, within the Israeli public, to Jordan, and to the rest of the world, including the Americans and the Europeans, then at that point, you can really discuss what are the ramifications of separating ourselves from the Palestinians, of annexing some of the territory of the next move. But you really, in my opinion, have to go through this in order to get there.
Mm-hmm. To ask one more question before we wrap things up, we have a question from Michael. It's a little long here, so I'm just going to read this a little bit, and I'll say
Is Bibi guilty or not? No, I'm just
that's the other elephant in the room. Or is he guilty versus will he be found guilty? I think are two very different things.
Or what is guilty?
Yeah. So Michael's question is, as I understand it, this will be the first prime ministership of Netanyahu where he will be stepping down further down the road, meaning as part of a power sharing platform with Benny Gantz, with Blue and White. Is this correct? And can you expand on that? You know, one, is this true? And two, do we actually think it's going to happen, or when would this certainly transpire, if at all?
First of all, correct. This is a very significant step. For the first time, this shiny, incredible product of Israeli politics called Benjamin Netanyahu actually has an expiration date. After 5 governments in which he was the leader, government after government after government, after being almost a constant in an always changing equation of Israeli politics and policies, Netanyahu says, I am stepping off. In a famous TV interview he gave on Channel 12 News a few days before the elections, he said, and even after the elections, Benny Gantz, believe me when I say I am gone, a year and a half into my term. And this is the big discussion within Israeli politics, because a lot of people don't believe that Netanyahu is going to go anywhere. Oh, he's...
Present company included, by the way.
Yeah, he's never going to leave now. But leaving is also a very flexible term, Justin. Mm-hmm. I mean, I want you to think about that, because even if he does give the premiership to Benny Gantz in a year and a half, the agreement between them is that a year and a half later, once Benny Gantz is done, each of them gets an extension of 6 months, so that this government lives its entire 4 years before they go to another round of elections. So that means that coming into the elections, Netanyahu is again premier. So that's one point. The second point is leaving as in going where? Is he necessarily going to start growing flowers in his residence in Caesarea? Or remember that Ruvi Rivlin, Israel's president, is supposed to leave his office next year. So could we see a reality in which a plea bargain is reached with the Attorney General? Bibi gets a slap on the wrist. He quits being premier. He's voted in as the next president of the state of Israel and changes residence from Balfour to the president's residence for the next 7 years. All is possible in Israeli politics. So whether it's going to happen or not going to happen, the question is, how is it going to happen? So pay close attention to the magician, for we never know where that card is going to go.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, all is possible with Israeli politics and Bibi Netanyahu. And, just to kind of end it on this, you're, I think, rightfully describing that, with all the things that Bibi has been accused of doing, that proof has been presented of, said guilt or of said complicity, he keeps on getting reelected, or, Likud keeps getting elected. And by extension, they know that means Bibi will be the head of the party and therefore the prime minister under those circumstances. I think a lot of that has to deal with Israel cannot see when I say Israel, I mean the population, Israel's citizenry cannot see beyond the status quo, what life would actually look like after Bibi Netanyahu, because he's been there for so long, because, love him, hate him, don't have an opinion. His government and certainly his premiership has really shown like real unprecedented growth for Israel on an economic scale, on a foreign relations scale. Depending on how you value those things is certainly up to the individual. But his tenure has shown Israelis what can be possible. And for the most part, they've enjoyed reaping those benefits. And I think a lot of them are afraid to see what will happen next with him not there, whether that pertains to security, whether that pertains to the Palestinians. Economics can relate to that as well. So I think that's kind of the big mystery that, we don't want to go past where we can already see.
That's very true. Even if some of his policies have been rather harsh, when you look into what you mentioned before, Israel's very expensive, tough to get buy an apartment, make a living, even during coronavirus. The truth also is that Netanyahu has been a constant in the lives of many Israelis. So you'll see videos of of a 4-year-old Israeli girl who would say, Rak Bibi, only Bibi. What does she know? But only Bibi is what she really knows and what her big brothers and sisters know, and her parents probably to a degree know. So that's very true. That's why the departure of Netanyahu, whenever that may take place, is going to be the end of an era for Israel, and will cause a reshaping of the Israeli political realm and the Israeli political system. And like many other people say, who is better than Bibi? Remains to see.
To leave everyone with a little anticipation and something to think about as we close this unbelievable webinar session, who do you think comes after Bibi? And I don't mean who will directly be the premier once, if, and how he steps down. I mean, who becomes the next Netanyahu? Who becomes the next Ben Gurion? Who becomes the big pioneer of Israeli politics? The next, effectively Melech of Yisrael.
So I have two thoughts on this. One is a hope. It's a hope that for once we're going to get somebody gray who will actually manage the Israeli government with efficiency and with less drama and less fireworks. You just want somebody who can focus on the work and hope that it's going to last. But knowing Israel, tough chance of that happening. I also think that Netanyahu, like many other supreme leaders, in a good sense, rather than the other supreme leader,
not the Iranian one,
did not allow for any shrubbery around him. And whenever somebody rose to any kind of challenge and was able to put themselves on the same line as he was, they were immediately chopped. So you won't see any competition there. It's like the famous joke of what makes the number one so powerful? The number of zeros behind it. So Netanyahu made sure he didn't have much competition. And whenever somebody was deemed a competitor, they found themselves, grazing in some other meadow. When Dani Danon was a threat, he was sent to the United Nations. Gilad Erdan is an up-and-comer. He gets the double deal. He will be the ambassador to the UN and the US. I'm leaving you with that thought. Mm-hmm. So you think about where these people ended up. Gidon Sar, Nir Barkat, who is very popular in Israel, 1 shekel a year, high-tech startup, millionaire, eloquent, such a manly man, stopping terrorists in the streets of Jerusalem.
I remember that. That was.
You remember. And what is his position in the government? What portfolio did he get? None.
Boom.
None, Klum, but he did get a spot in that picture in the district court on Sunday. And otherwise, none. So I think, in my opinion, the black horse is yet to be seen. It's someone that you and I have not yet seen rising on the Israeli political sphere, because there is much apprehension by many to enter into this sphere as long as Netanyahu is at the helm. And once Netanyahu is moving on, you will suddenly see the arena erupting with new and other forces, from whence you will see that next leader of Israel. That's my opinion.
Thank you, Shahar. Before we close up, I'd like to give you a quick second just to talk about your work at JBS, part of your new role and what you're doing, especially to reinvigorate, real Jewish digital content in the 21st century. Many of us, through whether it's social media or even just sort of traditional media, it's kind of like the same stale old like Jewish yenta type of engagement. I know you're really looking to revolutionize that, and that's something the Jewish people, in my opinion, desperately need. Can you talk a little more about that?
Absolutely. Just to take everything that you do with Fuel for Truth and try to take it to the next level by digitizing it and by looking for those cutting edge stories that exist out there, that if we only knew, what are we looking for? We're looking for a power grid that's going to empower us in our interactions with the world. And the biggest empower ever will be knowledge. If I'm able to know, and my knowledge is not confined to, when I'm going to speak at a shul, or if I'm going to have a meeting one-on-one or engage, if I have a platform in which these stories can be shared, then we are somewhere else. A few days ago, I spoke with the head of Israel's Innovation Authority. And it was amazing to hear about the amount of funding the Israeli government is funneling into startup companies that manifested in 2 exits in the course of the coronavirus the last few months in Israel. 2 times when Israeli companies were acquired by international entities. It was manifest in Israeli ingenuity in finding solutions for the coronavirus. We must find a way to share these stories with the world. What you do in Fuel for Truth is creating ambassadors and making sure that these strong, powerful, knowledgeable individuals are able to ambassadorize for Israel in a proactive manner for the Jewish people and for Israel. And that's exactly what my vision is in giving those raw materials to these ambassadors to be able to use and leverage for the benefit of Israel and the Jewish people, especially in this time.